Hello, this is Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity, having a second conversation with Thomas Neto about self-ownership. I'll put a link to our first conversation in the description, which I recommend people have a look at, not just so they know more of what we're talking about in this conversation, but also because we touched on a lot of really good points within self-ownership, covered morality, and various different aspects. And we're basically just sort of carrying on the conversation today because there's obviously lots of things we didn't touch on, and even some things I think we did touch on in our previous conversation that we'd like to kind of readdress now that we've both obviously had time to think about it. And just as a very brief introduction to anyone who's watching this video who's not familiar with the Nations of Sanity project, the project is basically built on the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement as a way to create a truly free society with truly equal rights. And the non-aggression principle is a moral principle that's based on the concept of self-ownership, which is why this particular conversation where we're kind of going into the concept of self-ownership was such an important conversation that I thought was worthy of putting up on this channel to include with the other content about that project. So we haven't really spoken much specifically about Nations of Sanity as a project. We're more dealing with the concepts and the principles and the morality, certainly in the last conversation and probably mostly in this one. So I'll pass it over to Thomas now, just to get the ball rolling on this conversation. And did you have a preference over where you wanted to start off on this conversation?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me back again to discuss this. Obviously, it's a very in-depth dive into this topic. It's very there's all sorts of ways you can explore it, all sorts of things you can talk about. I think we had a lot of fun, both of us, exploring the concept in our last conversation. Happy to do so again today. I think we can go ahead and continue from where we left off last time. Specifically, the comment you made about how you don't view people as property. Once again, feel free to correct any characterization I might make to your comments. Yeah, we had a lot of, I think, interesting ideas shared in the previous conversation. We did touch on morality, although obviously that's also a complicated and deep topic, even if in and of itself. Obviously, you know, whether we'll go into if morality comes from self-ownership or if it's something innate or if it changes. Like I said last time, morality for me is something very messy and complicated. For you, obviously, you have this incredibly streamlined, well-crafted view of it. We can, if you like, go back to that as well and explore that idea as well some more. We could also go over, we didn't touch upon slavery. Obviously, self-ownership, it's a long-arching concept. There's a lot of ways you can view it. It's almost like a lens you can use to not only think about what rights you have, what rights you don't have, what rights other people have, how you interact with each other, and how it interacts with society, how you should behave from it. So a lot of different angles we can take here. If it's okay with you, we can start off by going from the last comment you made, which was the after our conversation, we got to the point where you said, once again, that you don't consider people to be property in this idea of self-ownership. And it was a very interesting idea. If you wouldn't mind, I would like to go over that with you.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Do you want me to elaborate a bit now?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, basically, because I think because I did rewatch our conversation, obviously in preparation to this, and it was sort of near the end of the conversation where we got round to that aspect of it, and it seemed to kind of clear up a lot because it seemed a lot of, I mean, not to say we didn't have other areas where there were disagreements, but it seemed a lot of it was more down to the language we were using to describe the concept. And obviously your objection was for the idea that people are property, but that wasn't my contention, that people are property. And although I can understand where you got that from, because obviously self-ownership, ownership, I understand the link. But the way I conceptualize it is because I don't view ownership as having to pertain to property. And the kind of linear path that I take to get to property ownership is I start off with self-ownership, as a concept, and I conceptualize that not as saying that you're property, but just saying that you own yourself, not as property, but as the person who has right over yourself. I mean, one of the things about saying self-ownership, I mean, I often define it as basically saying you have right over yourself. Ownership and right over seems almost a synonym, almost saying, you know, the same thing. So I'm starting off with self-ownership before property even exists in the in the kind of linear progression of conceptualizing things. Before we've even dealt with the existence of property, I'm saying you own yourself, which means you have right over yourself. That's kind of what I mean when I say ownership. And then I say, because of your self ownership, what you can then do, because you own yourself and you own your actions and you can own the product of your labor, you can therefore create something that would be property, um, that you can then own as an extension of your self-ownership. So you would own that property because you own yourself, and you're extending your ownership over yourself to property. But it's not, I'm not saying that you're property, because that has a kind of circular nature of it, to say, you know, you can own property by owning yourself, which is property. It kind of, that seems to have like a circular logic to it. But I'm saying, well, no, I'm not doing that. I'm starting with self-ownership, but I'm divorcing the concept of property from the concept of ownership in the way I conceptualize self-ownership. Like I say, I'm basically saying you have right over yourself. You own yourself in that way. I think that was one of the sticking points when we were speaking last time, was because I think you viewed ownership as always pertaining to property, whereas obviously I didn't. And I think that's where we kind of were at cross purposes a little bit on that. But yeah, so that's basically where I'm coming from. I'm basically saying you start off with ownership before property is even a thing. And then from that, you can then create things that are property, but you yourself are not. And I would say that applies to all sentient beings. We're not property, none of us.
All right. Why is that? Should we not be considered property? Just to play devil's advocate a little bit, do you think it's immoral to consider people property, or what's your reasoning behind that?
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I do think, I mean, apart from the fact that it doesn't work in my linear progression of how I conceptualize it, but also I do think there's some fundamental, and perhaps I should have Googled the definition of property just to make sure I'm not misspeaking here. But for me, property, there's something about the definition of property that excludes sentient beings. Like, I don't know how best to describe it, but trying to think of how to best to describe it, actually. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an issue there, because I mean, because basically a property isn't a person. You know, you can be a person or you can be property, I suppose, is the kind of the way I conceptualize. You can't be a person and property. And for me, if you're a sentient being, then you're basically a person, even if you're not a human. Even if you're not a human being, you know, I know person attains to humans, I suppose, more. But I'm getting a little bit jumbled with the language here a little bit, but if you follow, I haven't really thought about how I can properly explain the difference between why we're not property. Like I say, other than the progression of self-ownership to property, other than just saying I view property as objects. Yeah, I suppose that's probably what I'm saying. Like as objects, you know, rather, and we're more than objects. You know, we're beings. So yeah, that's probably the best way. Sorry, I rambled there. I was working it in my own head, but yeah, that's basically it. Property is an object, and sentient beings are beings, and they're different.
Well, in that case, we completely agree. Absolutely, I view property exclusively to objects, and well, in terms of definitions, I suppose you do legally own your pets. If we delve into the slavery issue, the definition would be, well, this person is someone's property by that definition of a slave. I think ideally, uh, people ought not to be property. Same thing with animals in a certain way. Um, that's how I would feel about it. But we have to go into a little bit more of a conversation there in terms of animals. But if I suppose neither of us have really gone through like every step of why isn't a person property, or why shouldn't they be? And we're around in the same around the same page. And so it's great that let's have a back and forth, and see if we can figure out any conclusions uh, that we might reach. Um, yeah. So once again, I agree with you that I view ownership pertaining only to objects, or that ideally that should be the case. I do remember you phrasing the relationships you would have with a relative or with a friend as owning that relationship, or with a
Yeah,
football team.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, actually, I mean, that's probably one thing we probably should have done at the beginning of this conversation, was just as a review of what we spoke about last. As I was reviewing what we discussed last, I actually think I would probably concede the point to you regarding language, because, like, obviously, I made the point, although I obviously didn't use it as a outright proof, but I did sort of use it to bolster my case about the idea of our language implying a kind of understanding of self-ownership by the way we talk about, me and my hair, and you and your eyes, and all the rest of it. And I think you are correct when you said that rather than signifying ownership, it's actually more signifying in relation to, rather than rather than ownership of. So I would actually concede the point to you on that. And although I think my point about owning relationships and stuff like that, I think that was just kind of a desperate grasp to try to hold on to some kind of validity of ownership. I mean, I don't think it's without value in the sense of saying that I could still make the case that when we're talking, because obviously your can pertain to ownership. It doesn't necessarily have to, because it often can just, like I say, pertain to, as in relation to, as you said, and I think that's right. And I think, like I say, I concede your point on that. I do think there is the possibility, and I think that's what kind of drew me to that line of thinking, that maybe when we say it, like when we say your eyes and when we say your hair, we are, even though it doesn't necessarily mean that, because it can just mean in relation to, like, your sister and your football team. But I do feel like many of us deep down attach more of an ownership in our minds, if you know what I mean. But it's not, it's just something that I kind of it's basically because I suspect that we all accept self-ownership deep down if we really thought it through in our heads, and played with the concept and all the rest of it. So it was kind of more of that, and I thought, oh well, maybe that alludes to it in our language. But I do think you were actually correct to kind of say, even, like I say, even though I wasn't presenting it as an absolute proof or anything, I still think you were correct to say that it's kind of still a very tenuous, kind of weak assertion, even just with the implications, because you've got too many instances where your does pertain to just saying in relation to, and there is no ownership implied by the word. So I would actually concede your point on that, and say that you were correct on that. So.
And even if now that we've reached the idea that people aren't property, or shouldn't be property, if you say your eyes, well, your eyes are part of you, and you can't be property. So even in that sense, the use of the word your would.
Yes, but the only thing I would say to that is, obviously, for me, property and ownership are separable. So, like, I still think that when I talk about my eyes, I am talking about my eyes that I own, but they're not property, because, like, I own myself, but I'm not property. So in that sense, I'm still saying it like that. But what I also am saying is, I do concede your point that that doesn't really imply it, because I also say my brother or sister, where there's no ownership, or, even if I want to try and say, oh, I own the relationship, I don't own them, and I'm saying my brother, I'm saying my sister. So, and basically, you are correct that. I mean, I was thinking, oh, sometimes, I mean, although, your does apply to ownership, it can do, it's certainly not, doesn't have to only apply to in relation to. And even the ownership is still connected to the in relation to part. But I think ultimately the meaning behind it is in relation to. So although it can apply to things you own as well, it doesn't necessarily. So the fact that we describe your eyes as your eyes doesn't necessarily mean that we're implying ownership there, because we could just be implying that they're the eyes in relation to the body that's in relation to, so, like I say, I would concede that point on that, even though the property thing doesn't necessarily go with me, because I do divorce ownership from property. but the relation to thing, I think you're correct. So yeah.
All right, great. Just as an aside, there's no need to say that you're conceding a point to me and that sort of thing. We're in the pursuit of truth. Both of us are both
Yeah.
flawed. I think
No,
when
but I
discussing
just
these
want.
ideas,
Sorry, go on.
yeah. When discussing these ideas, the point, the objective for us is to figure out if what we believe in, or if these concepts or arguments are sound, if they can be proven or disproven. We're both in the pursuit of truth, and you in particular with this Nations of Sanity project, in the pursuit of the best way to have a truly free society. So that's the main goal. That's the objective.
Yeah, no, I agree. And
But
I wasn't saying it in a kind of points tallying kind of way. I just meant like that's actually one area where I kind of when I was watching this back, that was kind of one area where I was like, actually, you're wrong there, Matt. Or like, he's right. It is in relation to, and although you can talk all you like about how you think people underneath really, the fact of the matter is you don't have that implication there. So yeah, I just wanted to be clear that I've actually changed my tune on that particular point. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't kind of invalidate anything else around it, but it's just that kind of, that particular point, I think you were correct. So I think it was just worth kind of clarifying that I've come around to your way of thinking on that one.
all right, yeah, no, we understand each other perfectly. All right, I think maybe if you're willing, we can dive into why shouldn't we want people to be property?
Why should we want them to be?
Why shouldn't we? Why should we not want them to be property? Why shouldn't we want to classify people differently to objects? Classify. Well, I was going to say ownership, but of course, self-ownership has the word inside it. So, um, and not why do we? Yeah, why do we want people to be self-owned non-property entities? If
Um,
that makes
Yeah, it does make sense. I suppose the thing for me is that I suppose I've never approached the question from that direction before, because for me it was more a case of why would we be property? Because I've started off not considering us to be property, and I've started off with our self-ownership over ourselves without property even, existing in the conceptualization, and then from there creating something that is property and recognizing that that's different to me because it's an inanimate object. I mean, for example, and actually that's a good point, actually, is because in addition to creating property, we also create sentient beings, but they're not our property. So that's probably worth noting. When we procreate another sentient being, we don't say we've created property like we do when we say we built a car or built a house or or whatever else property that we've created. So I think, although I don't want to cop out on the question, but it's more that I suppose because I've not approached it from that angle, because I've come from the opposite direction. I basically, for me, it's not about saying why should we say that we're not property. For me, there's no argument for saying that we are, because for me, I've started off on the premise that there's no such thing as property. We're sentient beings, which is a separate thing, but we can create property by using non-living material and what have you to create, think what we would call objects, and which we distinguish from beings. So when we create a being, that's not property, that's a being, and that being, there's a self-owning individual in there, even though, as we spoke about before, they're not a fully autonomous, fully conscious, understanding being that can take control of their lives, but there's still a self-owning individual underneath that, even if we characterize them as asleep or however we want to kind of conceptualize it. So that's kind of, like I say, I hope that doesn't appear as a cop out to the question, but that's how I think about it. For me, it's not about, well, why aren't we property? It's like, well, why are we? Where's the reason for saying we are property? But that's just because of the way does that make sense?
No, absolutely, and it happens to be the exact position that we share, the exact same position, the same viewpoint on that, and it's in fact one of the reasons that I like to debate self-ownership. Um, Obviously, you don't, but some people would consider human beings to be property, hence the name self-ownership. And I think really our disagreement is down to linguistics. Again, to you, ownership. It doesn't apply to human beings, it applies to objects. And when you have self-ownership applies to human beings, but they're not property in that sense. And it's what allows them to, it gives them their rights, it gives them the right to own property and so on. It might be down to linguistics, our disagreement there. Um, if there is a different, if there's a difference between self-ownership and property ownership, why use the same word? Because clearly we're talking about different concepts. I think when you refer to the ownership of an object, it doesn't give the object any rights naturally, and an object can have rights because it's not a person, or it's not alive in the first place. And self-ownership does give a person rights. It gives them morality. Ownership of an object, the fact that it can be owned. Uh,
Well,
I mean, it just seems like very different things that we're using the same word for.
I understand what you're saying, but the way I view it is you're not using the same word, because you're saying we're using the same word because you're focusing on the word ownership. But I'm saying, well, we're not using the same word because we're saying I'm talking about self or property. Like, that's the distinction. And because, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, because the link between ownership and property. But when I talk about sort of self-ownership, which is obviously where I start from, that excludes property, I'm basically talking about your right over. Like, when I'm basically sort of saying ownership in the sense of your right over. So when I say, so then you create property which you own, I'm also saying you have right over that property, just as you have right over yourself. So you've extended your self-ownership to property, in the sense that you've extended your right over yourself to these objects that you also claim right over. Does that kind of make a little bit more kind of sense? If if you take ownership out of the conversation for a moment and replace it with right over, which is kind of saying the same thing, but it just excludes the property connection for a moment. If you just say, I've got right over myself. If I create property, then I have right over that property. Now, instead of saying right over, I'm saying ownership. I'm essentially saying the same thing. And that's why that's why I can divorce ownership from property quite easily, because for me, the way I use the word ownership is it doesn't pertain only to property. It pertains to anything that you have right over, ownership in that sense. So, like I say, you start off with self-ownership, which is your right over yourself. I build a house and I have right over that house. Obviously, the house itself doesn't have right because it's not a sentient being. It's just an object that exists as an extension of me. Whereas, obviously, if I get together and I procreate a child, that is a sentient being. So again, even though it's the product of my labor, there is an ownership there, in the sense of I have an ownership over the duty of care to the child that I brought into the world, because like I say about, that's the rights and responsibility thing. I have right over my actions. I own them in that sense, but I also own my actions in being responsible. So I brought my child into the world, so I'm responsible for him. You're not responsible for my child because you didn't bring him into the world, which kind of connects to this positive obligation thing, which we'll touch on later maybe. But so that's where I kind of come from. It's almost like, and I think if you almost replace the word ownership with right over, you'll probably find that you don't have the problem that you're currently having. But but in my head, even if it doesn't work because you maybe using different language, in my head, I'm saying the same thing. If I say I have right over myself, or I say I have ownership over myself, I feel like I'm saying the same thing. And if I say I have right over that car, or I have ownership over that car, again, I'm saying the same thing. I'm basically making a moral claim over my like I say, right or ownership over something. So is that kind
I
of
think
clear?
that's a really good point. I was just thinking about that, and it really does solve the issue of ownership between property you create or the labor you use, and from procreation. So if you can use the word right to or right over your child and your labor, and they both apply. So it's this terminology. solves this issue between ownership. And it's once again, I would say it's um, what I would see as a solution to a lot of the linguistic differences we have, which is to remove the idea of property from it. So if you have a right to or a right over your child, a right to, a right over whatever physical property you create, you're removing the idea of property, and you've solved this problem. So it's great, and I think it was a really good point to bring over this idea of right to and right over what you create onto the world, your interactions with the world, whatever creation you may have, this right to, right over idea. Fantastic terminology to solve this idea. Before we get to positive obligation, should we touch on the idea of slavery? Because of course, slavery is talk about, because for me, the very definition of slavery specifically implies ownership of a person, which we're both against. Um, and so I want to explore the topic and see a little bit how our ideas are going to interact with this idea of a slave, a person that is owned by definition. And we've talked about this through messages before briefly, and we'll hopefully to the idea whether I do remember your perspective, but I'd rather have you explain it for yourself. Hopefully, get into whether a slave loses his or her self-ownership because they're a slave, because they're property of someone else, or whether they maintain it as a right despite being a slave. So if you're happy to dive into that idea, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it ties actually also to something you said earlier when you were talking about, I think it was when we were pertaining to like pets and stuff, and talking about how they're described as your property, like in a legal sense in today's world. And one of the things that's important, I think, to clarify is when we're talking about like ownership and rightful ownership and how things pertain to property rights, it's not necessarily going to fit with how things are legally described today, because I think there's many things that are wrong about how things are legally described today. Just as animals are classed as property today, and I think that is incorrect that we do so. And it immediately made me think, well, there was a time when we classed certain people as property, and obviously slavery being the obvious example of that. So the fact that there's a legal precedence for a certain classification doesn't cut any ice with me, because obviously I'm dealing with what's valid and rightful, not what governments have decided are valid and rightful, which sometimes might be the same thing. We both seem to agree that rape is wrong, but there's a lot of other aspects which we don't agree, and so just wanted to kind of make that clarification. And that kind of ties into what we're talking about with the whole thing about slaves and property right and being property and the whole self-ownership thing. Because when you say, does a slave have self-ownership? I'm saying, well, they do in the sense of they ought to. They do in the sense that by a proper, consistent appraisal of what self-ownership is, everyone has that right. But in the case of a slave, it's obviously not granted to them. It's been denied to them. It's been violated. So that's the way. So rather than saying they don't have self-ownership, I'm saying it's not so much that they don't have it. It's just that they have it, but it's being violated. It's kind of like if you said, does that rape victim, did she have the right not to be raped? I'm like, yeah, she had the right not to be raped, but unfortunately that right was violated. So, dealing with the principles and the morality isn't the same as dealing with the reality of someone's circumstance. And that's kind of what I would say with regards to slavery. So a slave, somebody who is a slave, has self-ownership by my moral standards and what I would say is even an objective standard of morality once you accept morality. But the fact of the matter is in reality, that self-ownership isn't doing them much good, because it's being ignored, it's being violated, it's not being respected in any way. And then the other point, just to add on to that, was because I said obviously in our previous discussion that self-ownership is critical to morality. And my point was with regards to the slaves is because I think you said, can slaves make a, like a claim, can they invoke self-ownership? And I'm like, well, yeah, they can, because they haven't rejected it. But the slave owners, who we assume have rejected the concept of self-ownership, because they can't really be slave owners if they're down with that kind of concept, by rejecting it, they can't invoke it themselves because they've rejected the concepts. So therefore, they can't invoke self-ownership because they've already rejected it. It's kind of like if a thief says there's no such thing as theft and rejects the idea and the morality and the principles that define theft. If a thief says that, then they can't then invoke the concept of theft and complain that someone's stolen from them. A slave owner would have the exact same problem. He's already rejected the principle that he may later want to invoke himself. So yeah, I hope that all kind of made sense. And sorry, do you mind just 1 second? I just need to let my cat out. Bear with me a sec, sorry. Sorry about that. And typically she didn't go out anyway.
So you said a lot of very interesting things there that I'd love to go into. Yeah, well, we'll just do them chronologically. With you're putting forward the idea that a slave has self-ownership, but their self-ownership has been violated. Yeah, perfectly understand that. If you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to read a couple of definitions for a slave, because I think we be interesting to go through how we'll apply this with the definition and how we conceptualize this idea. So a slave can be one who is owned as the property of someone else, especially in involuntary servitude. This is how I would define a slave. I would accept that to be most people's most common definition. Another one is one who is subservient or controlled by another. I think that's insufficient because an employee can be subservient, can be controlled to an extent. So I'm not completely happy with that. And the third one is one who is subject or controlled by a specific influence. Again, it's a bit vague. It removes the idea of property, which is something that we're thinking about doing, perhaps, since, of course, to you, a slave having self-ownership is irrespective of whether they are property or not. So considering, would you be happy with the if I argue on behalf of the first definition, one who is owned as the property of someone else, especially in involuntary servitude?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would, yeah, because the second two, I agree with you, they're kind of vague and they don't talk about coercion or anything like that. So I don't think they really, yeah, I think the first one will go with.
All right, great. So you're putting forward that a slave has self-ownership, but their self-ownership is violated. In that case, how would you reconcile the definition of a slave and this idea? Or better yet, if I don't misunderstand you, this is an incorrect legal definition, because it does imply that the slave is property, and you and I both want human beings not to be property. So how would you define a slave? How would you rather it be called? Or what are your thoughts in general?
Well, I don't think that's a problem with the definition, because I think what we can both agree is that a slave is an invalid concept. It's not like so the fact that a slave is defined as property and we both agree that's wrong doesn't cause a problem, because we both agree that slavery is wrong, and we can even cite that as part of the reason why it's wrong, because people aren't property and a slave is defined as a person that's property. So like part of my objection to slavery is the fact, I mean, it's not just that, because there's obviously the coercion and the violation of will and what have you. But the basic premise that, you know, like basically what I'm saying is slavery is not a valid concept. You know, it's illegitimate. You know, and one of the reasons why it's illegitimate is because it deems people to be property, and people aren't property. So that's one of the reasons why slavery is illegitimate. It's not the only reason. Like I say, the other reason is also the coercion involved. But just that basic premise alone kind of invalidates it. So I don't have a problem with the definition of slave being a person that's property, because even though I agree with you, people aren't property, but that's also why, because of that, that's why slavery is wrong. That's why it's an invalid thing.
Sure, and we obviously completely agree. There's no disagreement here. Obviously, that slavery is wrong. Yeah, it's we can. I think I might argue a little bit differently from why to use slavery is wrong. But I think honestly, deep down, we would agree on the same reasons. Right? Why it violates someone's autonomy, which is the word I would use, and it violates someone's self-ownership for you. That's the terminology you would use. So we completely agreed on that. However, the fact that we both agree that it is an invalid idea, it is immoral. It's yeah, we can call it immoral, invalid. It's still an observable, factual concept. Like slaves still exist today, and the fact that we don't agree, we think they shouldn't exist, doesn't change the fact that there are slaves. Do you see what I mean? So the fact that we think it's wrong for them to be slaves, for them to be considered property, doesn't change their definition. It's two different things. Maybe it's a little bit of a is ought situation.
Well, it's a little bit that, and I think it's a little bit the language again, and I think it's a little bit because the thing is because we're saying that slave, we're saying that's an invalid designation because, you know, like we say, people aren't property; they own themselves, and slavery is declaring them property and violating their self-ownership or autonomy, as you would characterize it. So I'm kind of going from there and saying, sorry, I just need to. My mind's having a little seize up here. Sorry, could you put it to me again? Because my mind's kind of seized up a bit.
Yeah, no, of course, of course. And the fact that you're thinking about this is exactly what I'm doing the same thing. I'm going through. Hold on, that's a good point. But what would it mean, you know, in relation to this or that? So what you've suggested is that uh, the definition of slavery is invalid because slavery is wrong.
Well, no, I'll tell you what it is. Well, it's not that. It's slavery as a concept is invalid, but the definition of slavery isn't invalid. In the same way that rape as a concept is invalid, but the definition of rape isn't invalid. Like, you know, like, so like if you describe what rape is, you can describe the definition and that's a valid definition. But rape as a concept isn't a valid concept. It isn't something that's right because it, you know, violates. And I kind of using the same line of thinking with the slavery thing. I'm saying, yeah, like, you know, slavery is a concept that people have invented, but it's an invalid one. It's, you know, it's you know, immoral and it goes against these things. But we can still define an invalid concept correctly, if that makes sense. So you can still define what slavery is, and the definition of slavery can be correct, and still say that slavery itself is an invalid concept because it's based on fallacies and it violates this principle and what have you. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. That's why I think these two ideas are a little different. But then we're trying to integrate them together, right? Because you're bridging the two.
Well, no, because what I'm saying is like I'm saying like the existence of a slave, and I'm sorry to keep using the rape because I've brought up rape now, so but like the existence of a slave is like the existence of a rape victim. Like the existence of a slave in itself doesn't invalidate self-ownership because we're saying that they shouldn't be slave. You know, we're saying that that in itself is an invalid designation for them, and we're kind of saying the same thing about the rape victim. There shouldn't be rape victims because again, that, but it doesn't change the fact that what's happened is they are these things because those, you know, because that concept's been violated. But just as I say, I suppose the way I'm kind of conceptualizing it in my head is just because a rape victim's self-ownership doesn't disappear just because their self-ownership is violated. So they become a rape victim, but they're still a self-owning individual. It just so happens that part of their self-ownership was violated in, obviously, in this case, a very horrific way. I'm kind of applying the same line of thinking with the slave. So the slave is, in the way I'm saying that they ought to be, a free self-owning individual, but that freedom and that self-owning status has been violated, so that they're not a free self-owning individual in another sense. This is where you're going to have to come with me on the language a little bit, because I'm like saying, it's kind of saying I am free, but like if I got, let's say I was wrongly imprisoned and and thrown in prison, I'm not free. I'm imprisoned. Just like a slave isn't free, he's a slave. But he is free in the sense that he ought to be. He is free in the sense that his right is to be free. He does own himself, even if that ownership over himself has been completely ignored and violated. It's there, it's just being violated. Just like that woman, the rape victim's right over herself was there, even though it was violated and ignored. It's kind of like I'm saying, I know it sounds, because I'm using the same word for different things, I'm saying like, you know, you are free, but you're not free. But I suppose I'm saying you are in the sense that you ought to be, and that's the valid concept of who you are, and is consistent with this concept at the beginning. But the fact is that you're not, because someone has violated that right you have over yourself. They've violated your freedom. So that's kind of what I'm saying. I suppose it's more I'm saying that they ought to be. They ought to not be slaves, but in reality they are. But they're not really, you know what I mean? It's like they are slaves, but they're not slaves, because I'm rejecting the claim that they should be slaves by saying, well, they're not slaves, they're free people. But by saying that, that seems to be ignoring the reality of the fact that they're enslaved. So that they are slaves in that sense, but they're not slaves in the other sense. Does that make sense?
I think so. Well, actually, I think that was very well explained. I'm just trying to figure it out because I have certain disconnects with this idea. Obviously, because the way of talking about it ends up being this person is free, but they aren't simultaneously, and obviously linguistically, there's a problem there. But I would consider that to be akin to if you have a universal human right of access to water, but if you physically can't access water for whatever reason, it's too far away, you still have that right, but you can't access it because it's too far. So I can see how it translates to this idea.
Yeah, or I
I
mean, one other thing which perhaps makes it kind of clear, even though it's using a different example, is like I say, well, if you rightfully own your car and someone steals it, now here we're using different words because now they don't own your car, they're just in possession of your car. And as we spoke before, there's a distinction between ownership and possession. But the reality is that car is yours in one sense, but it's theirs in another, because it should be with you, it should be in your possession, it should, and it does, and it is yours in ownership sense, but they've taken it. So the reality is they now have your car. Now, from a moral point of view, we're saying, well, that's wrong. They don't own it, they're in possession of it. So in that case, we're using different language, so the distinction's much easier. The reason why I think it's more difficult with the slavery thing is because we don't have that distinction there. So we're kind of saying, well, the slave does own himself in the sense that he ought to, but we're also saying that he doesn't in the sense that that's been violated and that's been taken away, and claim of ownership has been made by somebody else invalidly, just like someone stealing your car. That's not an ought to, but the reality is they now have your car. The reality for a slave is that they are enslaved, so that somebody has deemed them to be a slave and is treating them as a slave and claiming ownership over them. Now, what we're saying, or what I'm saying on that, is that's not the reality of his rights. He's not a slave. He's a free individual who's been enslaved. It's kind of a wishy-washy way of explaining it, but I think it is where our language kind of fails us a little bit. And I'm just talking about human language. I'm not talking about us speaking different languages, but just the limits of human language in its entirety. So, but that's kind of what I'm saying. I'm kind of saying he's not a slave in the sense of he has self-ownership as a right. He owns himself as in, just like you own your car, as in that's how it should be. That is the ought that we have. But in reality, that's not the reality he's living in, you know? And it's easier to separate with the car instance because we don't talk about ownership when someone steals your car. We talk about possession. So we say, oh, they possess your car now. They don't own it, because ownership is implying the right. But with slavery, we don't say that. And I think that's a failure in our language in how we describe slavery, really, because we're saying these people own them, and they don't really, because ownership implies that there's a right to it. They're claiming ownership, they're possessing them, they're violating them and treating them as if they own them as property, but they don't actually own them as property in a valid sense, is, I suppose. So I'm saying he is a slave in the reality of how he's being treated and how he's being designated by society at the time, but he's not a slave in the sense of a real judgment of his actual rights as a self-owning individual. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think I fully agree with everything, but I've been trying to think of how then would you define a slave, obviously, because then the language that we're using currently is insufficient. I was thinking from your perspective, you could say a person. Well, it couldn't be a person whose self-ownership has been wrongly taken from them because they still have self-ownership.
I'd say
Uh,
violated.
it's well, has it though? Because if they still fully have it, do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, because it was violated. I mean, it's like your ownership over your car might be violated if it was stolen to you, even if you got it back. That right was still violated. Because, you know, it's like I mean, again, sorry to keep going back to the rape victim, but I do think it works as a parallel, because I kind of view a slave as a victim of any other violation of self-ownership. So, you know, you're a slave like somebody else is a rape victim, like somebody else is a victim of theft, like somebody else is a victim of murder, you know, but all of those things that you're a victim of, you know, your self-ownership can be violated, but that doesn't mean you don't have it anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's you know, like the rape victim's right over herself is still there. It was just violated. The slave ownership, the slave's ownership over himself, his right over himself is still there. It's just being, and obviously in his case, it's being continuously violated. Whereas obviously with the rape victim or the person who got caught, theirs was violated on a temporary basis, even though there's obviously lasting damage. But, you know, like, so their violation was temporary, whereas the slave's violation is ongoing, but it's still a violation of a right. I mean, it is kind of, again, I think this is the language thing, because I think in a sense, it is taking away their rights in one sense, because you're violating it and denying it and all the rest of it, but it's not taking their rights away in the sense of the way that you can't. You know, like, I can't take away your right over yourself in one sense. I can in the sense of violating it, so taking it away from you in the sense that you can't access it, but I can't take it away from you in the sense of it's always something that you have a right to. Yeah, like if I steal your car, it's always your car. I can steal it and disregard that right and violate that right, but it doesn't change the fact that as a moral reality, it was your car, rightfully, you know, in accordance with property rights and the rest of it. It's your car. No matter what I do to that car, I can steal it, I can smash it to pieces and all the rest of it. It's still your car. Oh, I suppose it doesn't exist, but you know what I'm saying. Whereas, so that's what I'm saying with the slave thing. That slave person still owns himself, but his ownership is violated on a continuous, it's been denied to him, but it is still his right. You can deny someone a right, it's still their right. And in one sense, you are taking that right away from them, in the sense that they can't access it and utilize it. But in another sense, you're not, in the sense that it's still their right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we found the what wasn't quite sitting right with me, and it's this idea. I think you've explained it very well. We end up kind of having a Schrodinger's self-ownership, where someone both, a slave both owns themselves and doesn't, and we have this absolute right of self-ownership that cannot be touched, cannot be harmed, but it can be violated, but not the same way. Yeah, I can see it's a complicated. You explained it very well though, and I absolutely understand the idea of the car example. I would say, for me personally, if you have something that is, uh, you have Aristotle's laws of identity. So A equals A cannot equal B. A can't be more than two things at once. We can't have a concept that's multiple thing, like it is absolute and isn't, and something that's absolute by definition has to be absolute. So that's where my problem with it lies. If self-ownership is an absolute, cannot be changed, challenged, scaled down in the sense of your child. The fact that it can, yeah, just the fact that it can be violated makes it not an absolute, and that's where it makes me a little
I get what
unsure of how to conceptualize it.
Yeah, I do get what you're saying, but I suppose what I'm saying is like, by me saying that you have right over yourself, and that's absolute, no one can take that away from you from a moral sense. Like, no matter what I do to violate your right, it's still your right, and I'm simply violating it. I can't do anything that makes it not your right, if that makes sense. Like, no matter what I do, no, I can, like I say, I can like, the problem is because we've got to remember we're talking about a moral assertion, we're talking about a moral right. So that doesn't magically create some god that will magically protect that right and prevent anyone from ever violating it. So it's the same with your car. I mean, it will always be your car from a moral point of view. It will always be yours, but that doesn't help you if someone nicks it. You know what I mean? So, and it's the same thing. Like, you can say to a slave, you will always own yourself. You will always be your own person and have right over yourself. Nothing the slave master does will change that, but that doesn't do him much good, because he's not able to express that reality, because that right is being violated and denied. But it's still there in the other sense, if you know what I mean. In the moral sense, the right is always there, no matter what you do to it. Just like your car is always yours, no matter who steals it and what they do with it. But the reality is you don't have it anymore. And it's the same with the self-ownership thing. The slave, it's there in one sense. He always has his self-ownership from a moral point of view, as in it is his right. He ought to be able to exercise that right. But the fact of the matter is it's being violated to the point that he doesn't have the right, in the sense of being able to actually, have it respected and exercise it and all the rest of it. But he does have it in the sense of the moral ought, the moral assertion of it's still his body, no matter what the slave, because the thing is about the ownership thing, and that's what I said about, like, when I talk about self-ownership being meaning you have a right over yourself, we're making a moral claim there. So when I say you have right over yourself, I'm making a moral claim. So no matter what I do to violate your right over yourself, it doesn't change the moral claim that you have right over yourself. All that I'm doing is violating that right. All I'm doing is defying that morality, but the morality is still there. I hope that makes a bit more sense.
Yeah, sure thing. It reminded me a little bit of the in the movie The Prince of Egypt. It's a story about the story of Moses and Ramses. And Moses at one point says to the slaves that are owned by the Pharaoh, he says, Pharaoh can take away your lives, your rights are gone. He can kill your loved ones, but he can't take away your faith. It's the one thing he can't take away. And you can make a parallel between their right to self ownership there, where it's something that can't be taken away regardless of whether or not someone's rights or self ownership is violated. Yeah, I'm still a little. I like my concepts to be very clear. If I find it hard to if for in order for something to be for me to be perfectly true and valid, it has to be very concise, very but I can completely understand you've explained it in multiple ways that I think perfectly would make sense to any viewer. Before moving on to another issue regarding slavery, um, I would ask if you would like to make an attempt at a better definition that we should have for a slave.
In what sense?
Well, a slave throughout this specific topic we've talked about, a slave is someone who has self ownership and whose self ownership has been violated. Is
Right.
that yeah? So um, it doesn't necessarily well in this sense there's no property attachment there. Your opinion of self-ownership is that it does not ascribe to property. So in this definition of a slave, he is not property. He is someone with self-ownership whose self-ownership has been violated, and isn't property in any way. So I think that's the best definition I think that I can come up with for what you're arguing.
Yeah, I mean, I
If
think
you have a better
sorry.
one,
Sorry, go on.
yeah, if you have a better one, go ahead. But it's obviously lacking what a slave is, sort of thing. So if you have this definition of someone who has self ownership, but their self ownership has been violated, if you simply take that and take it literally, that applies to anyone whose self ownership has been violated. So, for example, the victim of theft or any other crime. So, yeah, what are your thoughts? Can you have a better definition we should use?
Well, I actually think what we can do is, because I think that dictionary definition, the one that we worked from, the first one, the one that you quoted, I actually think that is a valid definition of slavery, and probably the only thing I would add to it, because obviously that defines saying, people as property, bought and sold, whatever, against their will. I would just add to that, in violation of their self-ownership. And for me, then the definition is perfect, because I think it does define a slave. The only thing that it doesn't add to the definition is to clarify that it's an invalid concept. So it defines, this is what, so it's like, so rather than saying a slave is somebody who's treated as property against their will, I'd say a slave is somebody who's treated as property against their will in violation of their self-ownership. You know what I mean? I just add that little bit on there, and for me, that completes the definition in a way that I'd be satisfied, just as I would be if you wanted to describe, a victim of another violation as saying, someone who's a victim
So,
of, sorry, go on.
could you just say that definition again? Because I didn't quite catch it, and I want to have it
So,
because
yeah, well, I'm basically, I don't remember the exact word for word definition that you quoted from the thingy, but it was basically defining slaves as someone who's treated as property against their will or something along those lines, was it?
yeah, that's
Yeah,
perfectly fine.
yeah. So all I'm saying is I take that exact definition and just add in violation of their self-ownership to the sentence. So I'd say a slave is somebody who's treated as property against their will in violation of their self-ownership, rather than just saying someone who's treated as property against their will. I'd add the point that it's in violation of their self-ownership. But either way, it's still a valid definition of slavery. But I just think without that, it's slightly incomplete, because it doesn't include any like you say, there's nothing in the definition of slavery that alludes to its invalidness, or not invalid, immorality. Does that make sense? Sorry, go on. You go.
Do you know what? Do you know what? I think you have made a wonderful, wonderful point, which solves a lot of these issues here. You've just said a slave is someone who is treated as property, and that idea, whether that solves the issue, right? Because they have all the characteristics of property, which is factually true. They can be bought and sold. Obviously, not mentioning how horrible the idea is, or how reprehensible it is. But they're treated as property, conserves their self ownership, and includes the behaviors that come from slavery, the the consequences of that. So, is treated as property is a fantastic point. I hadn't thought of that. I think that's really really clear in helping to um, to help with this definition. I think that's a wonderful wonderful point you made there.
Yeah, because
I'm
it
very happy.
separates it from, rather than saying they are property, we're saying they're treated as it, which, like you say, if you say they are property, it almost suggests that that's how it should be. Whereas by saying that they're treated that way, you're not saying that's how it should be. You're just saying that's how they're treated. So, yeah, I think you actually articulated it better than me. And to be honest, if you did word it that way, you probably wouldn't even need to add the in violation of self-ownership. I mean, you could, but it wouldn't be as essential because you haven't created the impression that it's valid from the description, because you've just said that's how they're treated. So yeah, no, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, excellent. I think that was a wonderful way to conclude that specific point. I still have one more idea to go through with you in regards to property. But if you'd like to go into positive obligation, we can do that. Obviously, I think we both enjoy going in depths on these topics. So up to you. I would just like to explore the idea um, that you made a point before, and I think it would be actually fairly useful to go over this to any listeners if they're curious. You made the point about when someone violates someone else's self property. You gave the example both of a slave owner um, forfeiting their own self ownership by violating someone else's self ownership. You also gave the example of a thief violating their self ownership by violating someone else's self ownership. Would you like to go a little bit more in depth of that, explain that concept a little bit, and then I can scrutinize points here and there, and we talk about it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of two things really. I mean, the first thing is just the kind of consistency is, you can't reject a principle and invoke it at the same time. So it's like, if I wanted to say that theft is wrong in an argument against why someone should take my stuff, I can't then reject the principle when I'm taking somebody else's stuff. So there's no such thing as theft, because I'm obviously not being consistent. So that's the one aspect of it where, you can't make a moral claim and invoke a principle that you've previously rejected. But the other thing is, and this is kind of more when we're dealing with like real world applications and with regards to forfeiting rights, is because self-ownership is a universal principle. I don't have the right to violate you. You don't have the right to violate me. We don't have the right to violate anybody else. So the protection of my rights depends on my respect for other people's rights. The rights that I have, like I lose my claim to the rights that I don't respect, basically, is what I'm saying. So, if I'm a thief, then I mean, obviously, not just for the fact that obviously if I take something from you, you can take it back because it's your property, but also from the point of view of like, if I take from you, then I've violated your property rights. Then someone can take from me, perhaps as recompense for you from what I've taken from you, and I can't make the claim, oh, well, I violated that, because, like I say, it needs to be, like, for it to be a universal principle, like I said before, about how, like, you know, my right to swing my fists ends at your face, or near it, or whatever. It's like, to make the principle universalizable, it has to be equally applied to everybody. So I have to respect the rights of yours that I want respected of mine. And one other thing, actually, sorry, there's actually three things. The one final thing as well is, because the non-aggression principle, that's, you know, like the moral principle that comes from self-ownership, it basically prohibits the initiation of force against peaceful people. Now, if I violate you, I am no longer a peaceful person, and the force that's used against me in response to that isn't an initiation of force against a peaceful person. It's an act of defense to protect the rights of others. So, like, basically what we're saying is that there's this right of self-ownership, and I'm saying that your right of self-ownership and my right of self-ownership and this person's self-right of, all of our rights of self-ownership, they're all the same. We all have that same right of self-ownership, and we all have the right to protect that right of self-ownership. So anybody who violates any person's rights, you have the right to use force against them, because you're just protecting that self-ownership. The same self-ownership you protect of theirs, you're also protecting of somebody else against them if they're obviously violating. So there's a couple of distinctions. I listed a few things. There's a couple of distinctions there. One is obviously the distinction between an initiation of force as opposed to defensive force. And then there's also the difference between violating someone's self-ownership and protecting someone's self-ownership. So you've got that kind of that distinction, if you like, with regards to how you can act, and then the right that you lose in correspondence to the right that you violate. It's not necessarily a vengeance thing. It's a simple fact that, you know, if I initiate force against you, the force required to stop me is not an initiation of force against me. It's not a violation of my rights. It's a protection of your rights. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I don't think we're going to have any disagreements whatsoever about self-defense. This, of course, is a very also fundamental aspect of libertarian or anarcho-capitalist or voluntarist philosophy. I believe you prefer to be called a voluntarist.
Yeah, I'm not an ANCAP.
Okay, all right, sure. So yeah, so but of course, usually or minarchists as well, they have this idea of that the initiation of force is wrong, and responding to initiation of force is fine. I would just yeah, self-defense is perfectly moral. There's no disagreements there. The only qualifier I would add is that it should be what's the word for it? Should be relative. The amount of force should the force of retaliation should be relative. I forget the word for that now.
Proportionate.
Proportionate. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So the what is done in self-defense should be proportionate. Otherwise, then it can be no longer moral. But yeah, we're not going to disagree about that at all. I do have some very interesting ideas here regarding the idea that you can forfeit your right to self-ownership when you violate someone else's. And I'm curious, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you may not have considered this. I just thought of this now as you were describing these ideas. It might be a little bit cheeky, but what if I propose the idea that as a slave's self-ownership cannot be violated, a slave owner's self-ownership cannot be violated either. So even though they are doing the violation, right? Self-ownership should apply equally to everyone, and it should be an absolute. And therefore, even when someone steals something or is a slave owner, they still have their absolute right of self-ownership, right? Because it's an absolute. So how can we reconcile this?
Well, the way I conceptualize it, and obviously pick out anything where you think I'm going wrong on this, but the way I conceptualize it is I'm saying that the to the force that you would use against anyone that's violating the non-aggression principle, whether it's a slave owner who's obviously violating the non-aggression principle, or any kind of criminal that's doing that, when you use force against them, I don't view that as a violation of their self-ownership, because what you're doing is you're protecting. I mean, it's almost like if we kind of conceptualize self-ownership as this one thing, like whether it's your self-ownership, my self-ownership, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's self-ownership, and we're protecting that. Everybody's in equal measure. So what we're saying is we can use force against people that violate other people's self-ownership in defense of self-ownership. Now you could say, oh yeah, but to do that, we're violating their self-ownership. But providing it fits within the proportionality that you mentioned, what I'm saying is you're not violating their self-ownership in a sense, because I mean you are in one sense, I suppose, but you're not in the sense that you're actually acting in protection of self-ownership, and the force that you're using, like I say, as long as it's proportionate, is to counter their violation of somebody else's self-ownership. So you're kind of trying to think of the best way to conceptualize it, because basically, because the way I would almost say it, to like if I was like using force against somebody who was like, say, a slave owner, for example, and he says, well, you're violating my self-ownership. I say, well, hang on a minute. Self-ownership is a thing that you're violating. I will protect your self-ownership just like I'm currently protecting the self-ownership of these slaves by using force to stop you from enslaving them. So, and just as I would do the same for you, kind of thing. But in this case, you're the one who's violating self-ownership. So the force used against you isn't being used. I mean, you could argue in a way, I suppose, but it's like the force that's being used against them is to protect self-ownership as a whole, because they're the ones that are violating self-ownership. And you could argue that you've got to violate their self-ownership to stop them violating somebody else's, but their self-ownership doesn't extend to the right to violate other people's self-ownership. Like, like I say about how your freedom ends, like to swing your fist that ends at my face. It's the same thing. Like so what you can say is like I say, as long as it's proportionate, as long as it's in that category, you can say that the force you're using isn't actually violating self-ownership, it's protecting it. And the actions that they are committing are almost causing the violation of their own rights, although it's not a violation of their rights, because, as I say, they don't have the right to do those things. And like I say, if the force is proportionate and necessary to prevent them from committing it, then the force that you're using is still defensive, and it is still being done under the protection of self-ownership as a whole. They're saying, oh, well, you're protecting their rights and violating mine. I'm like, no, I'm protecting self-ownership. The difference is I'm protecting them because they're the victim of your aggression, not the other way around. If you were the victim of the aggression, then I've been protecting you. It's like, it's not a kind of, it's like everyone has this right in the same thing. So I'm defending that right. I suppose that's why I suppose it's because I'm viewing it as a purely defensive act. So it's not. It's not. It's kind of like if I drag. It's because basically what I'm saying is they're initiating the violation of their rights, if they want to perceive it as a violation of their rights, is initiated by them, because they initiated the force, and the force you're using is only in defense and in protection. So it's a little bit like, I can't accuse you of trespassing in my house if I'm the one that dragged you in there. And it's kind of like the same thing. A criminal can't say, oh, you're violating my rights, if it's their action that caused you to use the force you're using against them because they were violating someone's rights. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you've gone over a few things there. Just very quickly, before I get into some of those things, would you say, well, no, first of all, I think we need to go over the word, the terminology of violating someone's self-ownership. because it's causing me a little bit of, I think, yeah, we're gonna have to dive into that because on one hand, self-ownership is absolute, and that's in the sense that even if someone's freedom is taken away, they still have their absolute self-ownership. And the fact that it's absolute is the reason why, even though they're in jail or even though they're a slave, they still have those rights, right? So when we say someone's self-ownership is violated, well, if you violate an absolute, it doesn't really add up, right? So what are we really saying? Are we saying it's been decreased, or it's been deformed, or it's not been taken into account?
Yeah. I get what you're saying. I mean, I suppose just the way I'm kind of conceptualizing it in my head, I'm basically saying it's like, because basically what we're saying here, just to simplifying it, is we're saying that everybody is these equal person with his equal rights. No one's allowed to hurt anybody else, and that's the rule. Like, that's where your self-ownership ends. Your self-ownership is the right to do whatever you want, as long as you don't violate anybody else's exact same right that you have. So what we're saying is if one person starts violating that, starts attacking somebody, then the force that's used to stop them is their doing, if you know what I'm saying. So you didn't violate their rights, even if you call it a violation of rights, because I mean, in a way, you're protecting that right. You're protecting it for somebody else because they're the aggressor, but you're protecting this right of self-ownership. But whatever violation of rights they perceive from the force that you're using, it's them that's initiated that. It's them that's caused that. So they didn't violate, you didn't violate their rights. They violated their own rights in a sense by violating somebody else's, because a bit of a wishy-washy way of explaining it, but I think you're
No,
following
no, no, no.
kind of what I'm
We
saying.
know.
But it's like,
Yeah, yeah.
so, so by doing that, it's them that's caused the action. I mean, just to give you a little example that might further illuminate this point, is because I had a conversation with somebody who said about, well, what if, because they were talking about proportionality of responses. I said, well, like, you can't, for example, you can't execute a petty thief because that wouldn't be a proportionate response. And he said, okay, well, what if someone, broke into your home or whatever, and you had like a tussle, or say someone stole some of your property and you resisted the theft, and then the violence escalated to a point where you did have to use violence, that let's say you killed them by accident, but because the violence escalated to that point. My point is because he said, well, then you killed somebody for stealing your thing. And I'm like, well, no, you haven't, because the escalation is on them. Like, they stole your property, which they didn't have the right to do. You tried to get it back, which you did have the right to do. If they continue to escalate the violence to, where they're fighting you, then you have the right to fight back. At each point, they're causing, even the force that you're using against them, by the fact that they're using force against you, they're also guilty of the force that you use against them. And that would also be the same if a third party came in. So if I aggressed against you, and say some police force or whatever came in and grabbed me and started using force against me and, hitting me or whatever, because they're doing it to stop me from violating your rights, then basically I've caused that. I initiated the force, and the only force I'm a victim of is the force that I caused, if you like, by causing a defensive reaction from you or whoever was there to protect you. So that's why I kind of view it as, you're not violating the rights of criminals and slave owners or whoever else you might use force against, because they don't have the right to do what they're doing, and all you're doing is protecting the right of self-ownership, which you would protect for them if they were the victim, and what have you. You're just protecting that, and any force that's used against them, anything that would be considered a violation, if they didn't do any of these things and you started using force against, then obviously you're assaulting them. But because you're doing it in response to their aggression, then they're the ones that they violated themselves in a way, because they violated this overall principle. They violated this self-ownership as an all-encompassing thing by attacking another self-owning individual. Therefore, the force that's the force that comes on them as a result is also their doing. Does that make sense?
I completely agree with you with the example of the escalation of force with the break-in. whereas someone enters your domicile to steal something, you resist that. You're acting in self-defense, so you're not violating their rights. If you were to get that object back, then obviously then you're back on equal grounds because you have your property not been stolen. However, if the person continues, then obviously it's their fault for escalating the violence. They're always at fault. There no issues with that whatsoever. Getting back to the question I asked, however, if we may, I'm still curious how we can violate self-ownership if it is an absolute. And I'd just like to point something else without getting too much into it, but because I'm curious about this issue. But self-ownership, with your description of a previous topic of the protecting a slave against against the slave owner, without going into, how could we do that in a proportionate way, because of course that would be very complicated. Maybe that we can talk about proportionality of response another time, because I know you still want to talk about positive obligation. But you described protecting self-ownership as a whole, and I was thinking throughout our talks that you've described self-ownership exclusively as a personal thing. Everyone has it, and everyone has the same rights, except if they violate someone else's. But we'll get into that because that's another issue. But I always see it as a personal thing. And now, if you protect self-ownership as a whole, that's now a different type of self-ownership, because self-ownership is about someone, right? It's not about everyone. It's an individual thing, if that makes sense. However, this is just an aside. You can talk about that if you'd like. But once again, I'd like to really think: how can we have an absolute self-ownership right that can be violated, right? Because if it's an absolute, what do we mean when we say that?
Okay, well, when I say absolute, I mean it's an absolute as a moral principle. So morally, it can't be violated, but it can as a practical reality. So it's like so when I say self-ownership is an absolute, I'm talking about the moral claim. So your right over yourself is we're making a moral claim there. We're saying you ought to not be violated because you have right over yourself. So your right over yourself is absolute. If it's violated, again, this is coming back to that thing about you've lost your right but you still have your right at the same time kind of thing. But what we're talking about is you still have your right with regard to the moral assertion of what ought to be the case, but you've lost your right in the actual practical realities of your situation. So that's what I'm saying, like with the slave thing, like where I say the slave does own himself in the sense that that's in that sense his self-ownership is absolute, because nothing, even though people were taking away his rights in the practical reality of things, they're not taking away his right from a moral point of view. And it's basically, I'm basically saying the same thing. I'm basically saying that's what I mean about absolute. I'm not saying it's an absolute as in it can't be violated, as in is it's physically impossible to violate you. I'm saying I can't steal from you. That doesn't mean it's not possible for me to steal from you. It is. I'm saying I can't morally, when we're talking about the moral claim, you have self-ownership. Nothing I do changes that in the moral sense, in the sense of what we're saying, that you have right over yourself. But in the practical sense of what you're able to enjoy and exercise about that right, then I can take it away from you. So that's kind of what I'm saying about it. It's like I can violate it in reality, but I can't morally violate it. So that's what I'm saying. Like you're saying, oh, well, if self-ownership is an absolute, then you shouldn't be able to violate it. And I'm like, well, it's a moral. So if you're talking about the moral claim, it is an absolute and you can't violate it. Morally, you can't. That's the moral claim, and that's the absolute. That's where I'm ascribing the absolute nature of self-ownership, is in the realms of the moral claim, in the realms of the morality, and you can't violate that. But in the realms of what's actually physically possible to do, then I can take that right away. I can violate it. It's not absolute because there's no divine force that's going to protect that right in any kind of absolute way. So it's like, just like I'm saying, your right of self-ownership is absolute in a moral sense, like you always should have it. But we live in a world where that moral assertion alone isn't going to create some divine protection for you. So we live in a world where your right might be violated. That doesn't mean you don't have that right. Just like I said, like the rape victim's right to not be raped isn't invalidated by the rape. It's just been violated by the rape. So her right is still absolute in a moral sense. She always had the right not to be raped. And even after she was violated in that way, it didn't change the fact that she had that right, and she still has that right. But that right was violated. So from a moral sense, that right can't be violated, but it was in a practical sense. So in a moral sense, it is absolute, but in a practical sense, it's obviously as fallible as anything else in the real world. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope that does.
No, that was interesting. I think I'll have to think about that answer for next time, because it's quite interesting. It's something I'll have to think about. I'm wondering now if then the self-ownership as a moral claim, if that can't be violated, uh, practically what is being violated? How can we discern that stealing is wrong?
Well,
Because,
sorry.
do you understand? No, no, go ahead. I was just thinking.
Well, yeah, I mean, because basically what I'm saying is, when I'm saying it can't be violated, is I'm saying according to that principle, it can't be violated. Like, so if you do violate it, then you've stepped outside of the realms of this concept and of this principle because you violated. So that's what I mean about the absolute nature of it. It's kind of like I say, it's divorcing the ought from the is. It's saying, okay, oh, actually, that's probably not the best. I mean, it's okay. Just I don't want to repeat examples, but just going back to like the car example, when I said about like if someone stole your car, it's always your car, no matter what. But someone stole it, so they violated that right. But it's still your right. It's still your absolute right. From a moral sense, it's your car, and them stealing it doesn't change the fact that it is your car. So in that moral sense, it's always your car as an absolute. But unless you sell it, but like it's always your car as an absolute. But in reality, it's no longer in your possession. So like I'm saying, and I'm using a similar kind of thinking with slight differences when I talk about your self-ownership. I'm saying your self-ownership is you always belong to you. But if someone steals you, like they would steal your car in the sense of enslaving you, and violate your right and deny it, then you could say, well, that's not very absolute because look at it, it's being violated. I'm saying, well, yeah, but that's wrong that it's being done like that. So, like if you say to me, can you enslave someone? I'm like saying, well, what are you asking me there? Are you asking me, can you enslave someone morally, or are you asking me, is it physically possible to enslave someone? If you're asking me whether you can, in accordance to this moral principle, then I say, no, you can't enslave somebody. But if you're asking me whether you can, as in, is it physically possible for you to do that? Then yes, of course it is. But it's not something that you're doing in accordance with this moral philosophy. So that's what I mean about the absolute nature. I'm not saying it's like some divine force that will protect your self-ownership. I'm saying it is a moral absolute that says that your self-ownership is always morally true or valid, or however you want to, say it, no, even when it's violated. Your right over yourself is always there, like we said to the slave. He owns himself, no matter what the slave masters say, no matter how society has treated him. Society might designate him property. He's not property. He's a sentient being. And society has designated him property incorrectly. So it's kind of, we're saying it in that. So in that sense, his self-ownership is absolute, because no matter what society or anyone else says, he owns himself from a moral point of view. But in reality, it's been violated and he doesn't have it in another sense of speaking, if that makes sense.
So this I think we're going down a really interesting road now, right? Because Well, obviously, throughout this conversation, I've had the issue of seeing self-ownership as two things going backwards and forwards. Has this kind of duality of it's both absolute and also can be violated. And I think with your example now, I had a thought that's really interesting. So the moral absolute cannot be violated. And you gave the example. We can go with this one or with a different one. The example of someone having their car stolen. So the moral absolute cannot be violated, right? Because they always own their car. So why is it wrong? Because they always own their car, right? And the car has been practically stolen. If this moral absolute has not been violated, then it's not wrong.
Um, okay, well, what I'm saying is, it is like if we say it's a moral absolute that you own your car. What I'm saying is it's an absolute in the sense that no matter what I do, you always own your car in the moral sense. Like, and it ought to be in your possession. Like, it ought not to have been taken from you because you own your car. The fact that it was taken from you means that right was violated, but it was violated in reality, like in a practical sense. Like in practical reality, it was violated. But as part of, I mean, and the moral principle was violated. But I suppose, because what I'm saying is when I say that it's a moral absolute, I'm saying that there's nothing I can do that changes the morality. I can change the reality. I can change what's actually happening, but I can't change what should. I can't change the ought that we've established. So that's what I'm saying. Like with the example with your car, I'm saying as a moral, when we talk about the ought, and when we talk about what the morality is, we're saying you are the rightful owner of that car. But that car was stolen, so that right was violated. Now, the moral right is still absolute because it's still your car, morally speaking. But in reality, it's no longer in your possession, and that. So it's kind of like, although I understand what you're saying, because it's like we're saying it is absolute, but it's not. We're saying it can't be violated, but it can. But when we're saying these separate things, we're actually talking in different realms. Because when we're talking about it being an absolute and you can't violating it, we're talking about the moral realm there. I can't steal your car in the moral realm, but in the real world, I can. But I'm obviously violating that moral principle by doing so. But if morality wasn't like if the morality of this wasn't absolute, like if your ownership over your car was not absolute, then there would be a scenario where I could morally own your car. Like I could, like that's what I'm saying about it being absolute. Like, because I'm saying there's nothing I can do that changes the fact that you have the moral right to your car. I can't change that. That's an absolute. So that's what I'm saying about self-ownership being an absolute, is nothing I do changes the morality. It's an absolute in that sense. But it's not an absolute in the sense of the practical reality, because there's no divine force that's going to protect your self-ownership and prevent people from violating it. But if people do violate it, then they're violating it. We can't, like I say, we can't change that. Like, again, going back to the car thing, no matter what I do to your car, it's always your car. I can't change that. And no matter what I do to you, you are always yours. you always have right over yourself, even if I violate that right. And in the moral realm, I can't violate that right, but in the practical realm, I can do whatever I want, because morality, the practical world unfortunately is not tied to morality. But so that's what we say, like, because when we're talking about, because sometimes if I've described the non-aggression principle, people say to me, oh, can you steal from people? And I'm like, no. So can you rape? No. Can you rob? No. Can you murder people? No. But when they're saying, can you do these things, they're not asking me if it's physically possible. Because if they wanted to play that game, they could, every time I said no, they could turn around and say, like, if they said, oh, can I murder someone? And I said no, and they pulled out a gun and shot someone, I said, well, that proved you wrong, didn't it? I'm saying, well, no, obviously you can in a practical sense, but morally you can't. According to this principle, you can't. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that it's absolute. Your self-ownership is absolute, as in it will never be morally right for me to violate your self-ownership. But it's not some magical force that will guarantee that no one will actually violate it. It just means if they do, then that's a violation, if that makes sense.
Sure thing. Yeah, I think this is another thing I'll have to think about. It's I think like right now it's creating three different levels where at the baseline you have someone physically taking your car, right? And without any morality, it's just something that can physically be done. There's nothing wrong done at this level. It's just someone walking up to a car, breaking the window, unlocking it, and driving off just physically. In the absolute is your right to your car that's being stolen, right? And this cannot be violated. You can't take away that it's your right to your car, as you've described very well. So this isn't what's being violated either. There's nothing wrong going up here. There's nothing wrong going at the bottom. That's what's practically happening. So there's this level in between the two where this action is actually wrong without violating the top level. And this is something I've just thought of this now, so we might need some time to go over this. That there's this level above the practical stealing of the car, which neither of us disputes. This top level of your absolute right to the ownership of your car, which cannot have any interference, cannot be violated in any way. But between there needs to be the wrongdoing of between these two, right? And we'll have to, I think maybe for next time, we'll have to find a way to explore it. It's a very fascinating idea. I've not thought about it before.
Okay, well, I'll just leave you with one thing to kind of to chew on then for our next conversation on that line is if I say, sorry, I'm just going to get this in my head right. If I say, oh God, my brain's gone. Sorry, my brain has gone again. Do you ever have mind blanks where your brain just wipes your mind of everything that's in there and it's done it again? Yeah. Sorry, could you just say again what we were putting a pin in?
Yeah, sure thing. But once again, we can go over this for next time
yeah.
because I would like to think about it myself as well. But I was talking about how there seems to be three different levels, the bottom of which is where someone physically takes a car and there's nothing wrong there. The top level, nothing happens wrong there because it's your absolute right to owning your car. And in the middle level, something wrong has to happen between these two things for this to be an immoral act.
Okay, that's what I wanted to say. I've written it down this time, so I didn't forget. Yeah, basically, so what we've got is we've got the realm of morality and we've got the realm of actuality. And I say that how we judge where something goes wrong is when one doesn't match the other. So, like, we have the realm of morality saying what ought to be the case, and then we have the realm of reality that's saying what is the case. And if what is the case doesn't match up with what ought to be the case, that's when your morality is being violated. So, I mean, the way I'm kind of conceptualizing in my head is I've drawn two realms. One is this moral realm where self-ownership exists as an absolute, and all of the and all of the things that you can't do in that moral realm because of its absolute. And then you've got this practical reality where you can kind of do anything because there is no morality because it's not obviously a real thing, it's just a concept. And then what we're saying is the way we judge what is right and wrong in the real world according to our moral thing is we match it up, and where it doesn't match up, that's where it's wrong. So if you've got this moral assertion in the moral realm that you have self-ownership, but that's not what's being practiced in reality, then we can define that as wrong because it's not matched up with that morality. So that's why I say about like this morality always existing as its absolute, and you can never violate it within the moral realm, but you can violate it in the real realm, in the actual, the practical realm of actual real reality of what we're actually doing. And so I'm saying that it's when one doesn't jive with the other, that's when you've got a wrong, is basically what I'm saying.
I think for next time we'll have to think of examples of how they link up, how they're interlaced. I think that'll be interesting because They seem to be very separate to me at the moment. These two realms, and how they link up or don't will be interesting. Um, yeah, I think we should go over finally the topic you wanted to go to, because we wouldn't want this conversation to be 4 hours. It's better to be relatively bite-sized. I think would be beneficial for you, for me, and for the viewer. I'm very I have quite a few things that we've talked about today that I would like to mull over, uh, think about for our next topic. And I think we've reached some very interesting conclusions, some uh, interesting ideas along the way. You did mention you wanted to talk about positive obligation. If you'd like to go ahead and give your introduction to that, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it now. I don't know if you also wanted to leave that for another time because it might be. I mean, the thing is with all of these things is they go quite deep, and they branch off into lots of things as well, which we have to kind of put a pin in and say, well, let's not deviate into there because we're still on here and stuff like that. So, um, I mean, we can have a little chat about it now if you want.
No, actually, now that you mentioned that, the previous conversation was about 2 hours. I think it would be a good idea to cap it off. Without a doubt, you're absolutely right. We're going to get very much into that in depth, so we can leave that as a little teaser for next time
Yeah,
and
definitely. I
have
mean,
our fun
it's
then.
definitely an important conversation to have. And it will also, the other reason why I thought it might be best left to another conversation is because it would also lead into, if you're happy to go down that route, but that particular subject would also lead into some of the specific ideas that I have related to the Nations of Sanity project, which address those issues. So this is what I talk about. The reason why I could probably we could probably have a kind of brief conversation about the issue, but there's so many things that it would lead to, and that would kind of feed off it. So yeah, I mean, if you're up for it, we could perhaps put a pin in that because I think it's a very interesting thing to delve into, and there's obviously implications and areas that need exploring and questioning and scrutinizing and all of that. So yeah, if you're happy to put a pin in that for the next conversation, then I'm more than happy to do so.
Yeah, I think that's best. It's a good idea. We do both like to explore concepts as much as we can. No doubt we could go back on a lot of previous topics and dig around more. Um, but yeah, I'm with you. I think we should leave that for next time.
Okay, well,
Which yeah, which in that case I would say that once again, thank you for inviting me on to have this discussion. It's very interesting as always. Look forward to next time.
yeah, you're more than welcome, and thank you for taking the time. As I said before, I really appreciate these conversations, and I'm really enjoying this because we're getting into some nice detail on this and thrashing things out. And as I say, like I'm learning, like in our last conversation, there were a lot of valid points you made that helped me. And actually, that's another thing I also, which we'll put in a pin for our next conversation, which we didn't get to in this one, was I wanted to talk about the whole autonomy versus self-ownership thing and speak about that in a bit more detail as well, which was another great point. And I won't go into it in detail now because we're obviously wrapping up this conversation, but that was also something that I found very useful with regards to how I'm communicating this idea, because I really thought about, because obviously you put it to me that perhaps autonomy would be a better term than self-ownership with regards to explaining a lot of these ideas, and I really thought about that. And I mean, I'll leave you with this, we won't go into it, but I thought about it quite a lot, and basically, because I don't view them as exactly synonyms, but they're so close in what they're describing that it's useful to use both terms. And the way I kind of conceptualize, and this is something that you can kind of mull over when you think about the other things, is the way I view it is autonomy is basically your capacity to control your actions, and self-ownership is your right to. So the only difference that I kind of put with regards to self-ownership and autonomy was the moral claim, because you were correct. A lot of what you were saying when you brought in the word autonomy, it can be used interchangeably with self-ownership with regards to a lot of what we were talking about, and it works equally well. But the only difference between autonomy and self-ownership is autonomy doesn't seem to make a moral claim. It basically talks about your capacity to control your actions, whereas, as I say, the only difference with self-ownership, even though it's very similar to autonomy and what it's describing, is it's almost like the same as autonomy, but in addition to that, it's making that moral assertion as well. It's not just saying you have control over your actions, it's saying you have right to control your actions. So yeah, I just wanted to leave you with that, and perhaps in our next conversation, in addition to dealing with positive obligations, I thought that might also make for quite a fruitful conversation to kind of delve into that as well. So if you're willing, we'll add that to our little list of things to touch on next.
Yeah, that sounds good. I've written that down. Autonomy, your capacity to control your actions, and self-ownership is your right to your actions. Yeah, we can go into that if you like. Sounds like an interesting discussion as well.
Yeah, I
Uh,
thought so. So, yeah, that's great. Okay, right. Well, I'll wrap this up. To anybody listening, thanks for listening. And there will be a part 3 to this conversation, and maybe even a part 4. And who knows where we'll go from there. I mean, like I say, so many of these things lead to other things and I enjoy going through all of it because it really does help me work these ideas in my own head and polish them. And and as I say, and because of the project I'm doing, I'm very keen to pick it apart and see where it works and where it doesn't and all of that. So I really appreciate, Thomas, I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation, and I look forward to having our next one. And to everybody listening, thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.